Thank you very much for having me here today, and particularly to Australian Pork for inviting me and bringing me here today. I guess I just wanted to start off by highlighting that I actually think community attitudes and consumer attitudes are two different things. People are frustratingly inconsistent, as we've already heard Jude explain, and perhaps if we actually started to look at these as two different things, two different types of behaviours, then perhaps we may be able to start to understand why people can be really inconsistent. So Andrew's already given my bio, and just to remind people, that I've spent most of my career talking to people about the role of science in food production. So my first taste of science communication was actually talking about the pig industry. That's a picture of Royal Melbourne Show. And then for 7 years, I was the education officer with an organisation developing genetically modified crops. And I must be a bit of a masochist if I'm picking farm animal welfare and GM crops as the issues that I'm going to spend my career on. Both are challenging in very different ways. But it was that experience of being at the coalface, if you like, and actually talking to people about the role of science in food production and focusing on the science, which we thought we were supposed to do back then, that I realised we weren't actually gaining any traction with the community. And given that most of the people I spoke to about genetically modified crops were in South Australia, and South Australia is the state with the moratorium, I kind of took that a bit personally and decided I needed to go and learn a bit more about how people actually develop their attitudes and their perceptions and responses to science. And so public of understanding of science is what I do. So even though I'm very much grounded now in research that's humanities and social science based, I'm in the Faculty of Arts, agriculture is still very much the topic of my research. And although this slide refers to the dairy industry, I think it really typifies the kind of mixed messages that we feel the community is really saying to agriculture. And Jude's already highlighted a lot of these kind of things. So we know that people love farmers. Australians love farmers. And when there's a crisis, they'll rally around together and they'll support farmers. If it's drought, bushfire, you name it, they're there. And the dairy crisis is another one of these examples. All these celebrities have come out and taken photos with their milk moustache to say, us people in the city, we don't understand what farmers go through and we're going to support them. The second image is a billboard in South Australia. There's several in Adelaide around on the way to the airport actually. Classic example of a mixed message, because here we're seeing people being critical of the dairy industry, and in particular the practice of killing male calves. So on the one hand, we love farmers, but on the other hand, we don't necessarily love everything they do. And these can be really confusing for farmers to try to work out, and particularly how we actually communicate with the community about what agriculture is doing. So to follow on from the data that Jude presented that was basically US based, I'm going to be showing you some data from Australia. And this particular piece here is from a paper in 2012 that was looking at perceptions of Australians of agricultural practices. So this is a survey of about 1,000 people. As you can see, the Nationals are on the left and the Greens are on the right. I don't often get to say that. But the central bar is the one that actually is the average of different voters. So obviously voting preference is a way to sort of think about the different kind of values that different groups of people have. But you can see that overwhelmingly, these are the people who answered strongly agree or agree, that farmers are seen as producing safe, clean food, they are engaging in sustainable farming practices, and they have good animal welfare. And as you can see, yes, there's a bit of a difference there between Nationals voters and Greens voters, but overwhelmingly, people are very supportive of the kinds of activities that farmers are doing. This data, actually there's an error on this data came out last year, and I have some problems with this paper which I'll explain on a future slide. But this is again a survey of around 1,000 people in terms of how they thought farmers were performing. And so you can see, I've left out the not so good because you can work that out by difference, but you can see that 77% of the respondents thought the farmers were making a good contribution to Australian society, that they were carers of livestock, educated about agriculture. Interestingly, the business operators kind of thing was a bit lower, and yet, sometimes farmers get criticised for caring about business operations. So again, that's another mixed message there. But again, overwhelmingly, people think farmers are doing a good job of farming. Here's some Australian data about trust, very similar to the kinds of things that Jude was presenting. Trust in farmers, overwhelmingly, they are the most trusted people within the food system. The least trusted are politicians, unsurprisingly. And you can see that the media is also not that well trusted, and retailers slightly more than media. But when it comes to knowledge, it's a very different kettle of fish. So perceptions are all really good, but when it comes to knowledge of agriculture and specific knowledge of agriculture, Australians tend to do fairly poorly. I said I was a bit critical of this particular paper, and that's because these were multiple choice questions, and you could argue that some of them were quite trivial and a bit difficult to answer, and I'm not too sure how I would have gone either. But if they were multiple choice, there's a 25% chance of getting it right. So some of these people are getting really, really wrong. And interestingly, the ones that they're getting wrong are the ones about the contribution to the Australian economy and sustainable farming practices, which I've already shown you, perceptions are that farmers are doing really well there. So the knowledge of these two particular factors is quite low. So in particular, the one about the voluntary environmental management that farmers participate in, the knowledge of the amount of time that farmers spend doing that on average is very, very, very low. And I think this is actually a missed ticket, really, if you're trying to engage the community. Also, the efforts to be more sustainable around greenhouse gases was low, and the contribution of agriculture to the Australian economy was also very low, knowledge of. And this is some work, again, the date's wrong, this actually came out from last year, but Graham Coleman and his team have looked at specific knowledge of farming practices to do with animals. Now, I know halal doesn't really affect you guys so much, but it's interesting to me that, again, in this one, you had a 50% chance of getting it right because you had to pick from two options. So people were actually completely getting this run wrong. So knowledge that halal involves pre-slaughter stunning was very low. You can see clipping teeth on intensively farmed pigs there is about 67%, right up to the use of a hot iron brand. And I guess they do that on McLeod's daughters or something, so that people know that that happens on farms. So again, we've got knowledge of specific farming practices quite low, but yet very positive perceptions of agriculture generally. How does this work, and what does this mean? The community trusts farmers to do the right thing. And you need to know what that is, by the way. And I'll give you a bit more information about that. But the community trusts farmers to do the right thing with the resources that you have access to. And arguably, they're public resources. People think they are public anyway. The land, we all share this country. You know, we share water, we share the resources. And you have a license to make money off that, provided you do the right thing. And we call this a social license. So this is often spoken of in terms of resources, organisations, mining and that kind of thing. But it is robust theoretically, and there's more and more work coming in on this on the scholarly side, as well as it being a term that is more and more frequently being used in agriculture. This idea that the community gives you a social licence to do what you do in a relatively unregulated way. But we know that community generally has have positive perceptions of farmers and not a lot of knowledge. And that means that tension around what the right thing is fairly fragile. Because we know if new information comes along and it turns out that you weren't doing the right thing, or what I thought was the right thing, or that the information that I had in my head about what I thought you were doing is not the truth, then the social licence can be revoked. And we all saw this with the live export industry. That's the classic example of an industry that lost its social licence overnight. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that that means that we withhold information from the community, not at all, and Jude's sort of spoken all about that. The idea is that you be transparent and never get in that situation in the first place. But how do we then start to regain a social licence if we've lost, knowing, as Jude explained, people don't tend to respond to scientific information. They don't necessarily trust industry commentators. Academics were pretty low on that graph too, which is a little disappointing for me. But, how do we even engage? And I think we've already heard from Jude that one of the ways to start these kind of conversations is to look at shared values. And they're one of the organisations that's been doing a lot of work on this is the Centre for Food Integrity in the US. Charlie Arnett usually does the industry talks, and many of you may have seen him. There's also been some other work in Australia, particularly around how we communicate around GM. So this idea of values-based communication is becoming more and more and more important. So our work then is really about trying to understand what these values are, and how people in Australia actually act on these values. So what we know about Australians and food is that we have lower rates of vegetarianism than EU, and as Jude highlighted, we actually define it a little differently than most people. We have very high average rates of meat intake. I think we're actually number one at the moment. We're concerned about our relative isolation on things like food safety and food security. Our acceptance of GM is midway, and that's in some ways used as a bit of a proxy for trust in food regulation as well. So we're more trusting than the EU, but less trusting than the US. Recent studies have shown that agriculture and food literacy amongst children and adults is pretty low, and we need to continue to work on that aspect. We're highly multicultural, which means our attitudes to foods and different foods are going to be very different and diverse. And of course, we have rising rates of obesity. I think we may be number 2 there as well. So the project that I'm presenting the data from today was called What Shall We Have for Tea? Very Aussie name. It was really about trying to understand the diverse issues associated with food ethics and food choice. So when people are making a decision that they feel is ethical in some way. And ethical choices are ones that consider a moral other, somebody who counts morally, or something that counts morally. Usually it can be groups of people, and that's where we see things like fair trade. That's an ethical choice around making sure that, you know, my choices don't impact in a negative way on other groups of people. But animal welfare fits into that spot. The ones that I've got a slide that sort of shows other things, but the idea is that you're considering other people, not your own family, not yourself, animals and the environment. And part of the other purpose of this particular project was to develop a framework for fostering dialogue around ethical food choices, and also to try and involve the public in food policy. It was funded by the ARC, of course. So this slide was not something that we were using in our research, but it's an easy way to describe the milieu of ethical food choices or ethical shopping. So this is from a group called Ethical Shopper, and you can see that they've got a range of things that they consider to be unethical. Now, we're not trying to check the validity of those claims. I tend to be a bit similar to Jude in that I actually want data on that impact before I decide whether it's ethical or not. And so I do think that science and ethics can work together. But they tend to throw in things like genetic engineering, and you can see that lovely term factory farming there, but also animal testing, habitat loss, packaging, chemicals. So this is the things that are talked about in the marketplace as being unethical. But ideally, we'd want consumers and the people within the community to reflect on those individually and make some decisions and do some research themselves. The data that I'm presenting and the kind of work that we do is not survey-based. I do actually have a bit of an issue with surveys as I've moved from quantitative biology, which is where I started, into this kind of research. Surveys really, in some ways, sort of prompt people to think in a way that they may not normally think when they're shopping or when they're talking to somebody else, because you give them an option to tick quite often. So if you say, do you care about farm animal welfare? Most people are not going to leave that box unticked. Of course they do. But that doesn't tell us why. So I see the difference between the kind of work we do and surveys as, you know, how many people like the colour red versus why it's important to them. So we know that people want to make certain choices and they want to buy certain things, but we don't know why. Or we might be wrong about why they do it. And that's the kind of work that we've been doing. And so from this 3-year project where we went around and spoke to about 70 people, we would accost people in shopping malls, and we would invite people to focus groups and things like that. And we'd have a conversation with them about what they bought, whether they bought anything that they thought of as ethical, and then why they did it, and try to encourage them to explain their rationale. It's like being a 3-year-old. You're going, but why? But why? But why do you buy that? But why? But why? And eventually people will actually try and reason through it for you. Sometimes you actually get people who go, actually, I'd never thought of that. And that's actually valid results for us, because if we're wanting to encourage conscious consumption, then we do want people to actually think about them as well. So theme 1, the big theme that came out from our data, was that ethical choices are not always about ethics. People still choose so-called ethical foods, foods that are marketed as having some kind of ethical quality or be more ethical in their production. They still buy those for a range of issues that are nothing to do with ethics. Taste. Food's got to taste good. They still buy it on the basis of a nutrition profile, or the idea that it's healthy. They'll buy it for freshness. They'll buy things on the basis of food safety, so there's perception that some of these foods actually are safer than others. And also price. Price always comes into it. And we did make sure that we included people from lower socioeconomic strata in our project. And this is a classic example here from Kay. When we were talking about fish, she said, fish, I only buy local. Now, most of the time when you see local spoken about in the literature, local is some kind of way that people can minimise the impact of their purchase on the environment. It's about reducing carbon footprint. That's the idea of buying local, the 100-mile diet, that kind of thing. However, for Kay, she's only buying local because she's concerned about the contamination of the waters in Northern Australia. So for her, buying something that's local, which may seem an ethical choice, is actually a personal choice because of a perception of food safety. So that kind of takes it out of that ethical domain and puts it into something else. In some ways, local was a proxy for her for safety. And this is where, again, we've got something deeper than we would have had we just done a survey. And this kind of thing keeps coming up again and again, particularly every time we have a food safety scare. And so this came out in response to the berries, the contaminated berries, and we start seeing these kind of movements: stranger danger, buy local. There's also a slightly parochial reason why people tend to buy local. They want to support local businesses. If you delve deeper, it starts getting xenophobic. And if you delve deeper, it even starts getting a bit racist. And I actually wonder whether that's some of the things that we're actually uncovering when we're seeing people's preference for locally produced food. And I'd hate to see that. But this idea of xenophobia, that Australia means quality and means safety and other countries don't, is certainly one of the proxies that people are doing. The definitions become very fluid and depend on the different people. One person's idea of something being ethical is certainly not the next person's idea of something being ethical. They vary according to the foods and according to the context, like whether I'm eating out or whether I'm, just buying food to make at home. And, how local is local. In Australia, tends to be, Australia is good enough. Even though the distance between, say, Perth and Cairns is still considerably large, and maybe sort of very different to in other countries. So here Mary recognises herself that it's an elastic concept what local is, because you've got to get your mangoes from somewhere. She's sitting in Adelaide, so they're not growing there. And again, Kay, for her, local is also where she purchases it from. She's going to farmers markets. It smells local to her. It's got a freshness about it. That's what local is, even though it still may have been transported somewhere. So again, these things can be very fluid, very wishy-washy, but these are still the perceptions that people have. Beliefs do not always equal behaviours. And as I said, part of that, I think, is this complex between a citizen and a consumer, and that citizen behaviour is about what I think should happen. Consumer is about buying food. There's not too many alternatives to food. So when people say to me, I must be doing okay because people are still buying it, that's because they're hungry. They don't have to be happy about what you're doing. Okay, so that's where I think it becomes really tricky. So it's not just social acceptability bias, and that's when people tell us what they think we want to hear because they're good people. They don't want us to judge them in the research. But it's also because it's quite complex. Darren went on for about 5 minutes telling us the story about how he just wanted some steaks and he couldn't process all the information. He was saying, I'd have to think about what the cow ate and where it lived and what was in its food and was the grain GM. and you just don't know, and you get to the point where it's too hard, I just buy it. I turn into a creature of habit. I can't find myself dealing with this. And that's the complexity that Jude was referring to. I just want a couple of steaks. So he gives up and he just goes and buys what he wants. So we are expecting consumers to process a lot of complex information in a very short space of time. And those of you who've been shopping with children will know that you have even less time. Trust and information. So in the absence of all of this information, people end up just going to labels they trust. A very small proportion of the population, and I mean, we're not trying to account for that anyway, but we do find there are people who go and do their homework. They will go and look things up. They will go and check the validity of claims because they're skeptical. So Stephanie here, she goes and checks the websites. She doesn't trust the supermarket to just tell her that something is what it is. So you are finding that there are people who want that information. They may not be doing it at point of sale, but you will get a certain group that are actually going and checking these things. So with buying animal friendly, when I drill down all that data, even further, there was very strong perceptions that these products are better quality than conventional. And this may explain why they're prepared to pay more money for them. Particularly with free-range eggs, they were saying that they taste better, they look better, they're healthier, and they're safer. So there's a food hygiene sort of aspect to that. And here you can see this person saying, yep, I prefer free range. And she grew up on a farm, okay? So it's not somebody who has no connection to farming. She's using that connection to talk about the kind of product that she wants. Free range cage-free eggs were the most dominant food talked about in this category. There was a couple of mentions of pigs, virtually no mentions of sheep and cattle. Now, is that because awareness is higher or just because the shorthand is, birds are in cages, pigs are in pens, sheep and cattle are out in the paddock and they're fine? I can't tell you that yet. We need some more research around that. But I think the other things are that, particularly with eggs, the labelling is really clear. People would say, oh, you can't read the labelling on meat. The price point means that even poor people can afford to pay the difference. The promotion and the high levels of awareness probably are having a big effect there. And it's easy for people to produce their own, the backyard chickens. People say, oh, they're free range, and I know that because they're mine. I've got the chickens. And so here again, Lauren, she was on a very low income. She was saying, I'm happy to pay the extra money. So she was one of the few that actually mentioned the chicken, to be honest. Which was interesting. So she said, I want hens that have been looked after. Does she do it for free range meat? Not so much. And then she's even realised that her own inconsistency there. In connection with conventional or intensive production, people talked about confinement. They'd use words like caged, even with pigs. The diet. People are obsessed with animal diets, and that they would use language like force-fed, which is interesting, but they would particularly use things like unknown. You don't know what they're being fed. Unnatural. They would talk about chemicals being in their diet, antibiotics and hormones. And of course, this was set up in complete opposition to something that's extensive, which is just all natural. Okay? Food hygiene and food safety, I don't know whether it's a discussed thing, but the idea that intensive is more risky and more dangerous than extensive was really strong. And they're skeptical of those claims. And this is a classic little quote here, that somebody would say, oh, but I know someone on a farm, and they'll tell you that sow stalls aren't that bad because they protect the piglety characters. People think sow stalls are farrowing crates. They really don't know what they are. So in summary, the idea that people are trying to change production broadly by buying these things is probably a bit narrow. What we think they're actually doing is using them as proxies for a whole range of other things. Healthier, tastier, better quality, fresher. These perceptions, as we've emphasised, are not related to actual knowledge of practices, and that intensive farming is seen as mass-produced and therefore low quality, but is also seen about driving profits, where profits are being thought about in terms and above other things. So that's going to be a tricky one for you guys to turn around. Just to finish up, I wanted to highlight some other research that we've been doing, because where does all this stuff come from? That's the thing. Where do all of these ideas come from? If it's not being taught in school, if it's just, where do these come from? And we suspect that it may well be coming from media, it may be coming from popular culture like film, it may be coming from the news, we don't know. Where do these ideas come from? How do they become embedded in the language that people use to talk about food? One of the places we started to look was how people talk about things at home. And I couldn't find any data on how people told children where meat came from. I thought, is that a really tricky conversation for city parents to have, particularly if they're not really sure what happens? So we have had a little bit of media about this even in the last couple of days. So this had 225 people in a survey. And we did find differences between rural people and urban people in the way that they talked about slaughter in particular. That's really what I was trying to aim at, was do they talk about slaughter? Or does the magic meat fairy come along and turn the pig into sausages? You know, so that's that sort of stuff. So we definitely found that urban parents and mothers, so women, found it harder to have these conversations, were more likely to feel conflicted about eating meat themselves, and were more likely to be sympathetic if their child stopped eating meat. Whereas parents from rural areas and fathers, it's like, you got to eat what you're given, it's all part of life, humans are meant to eat meat. But the commonality, and again, we're trying to talk about how we have shared values. How do we actually open the conversation? The commonality was about respect. Parents wanted to tell the children that the meat had been produced humanely, had a good death, and we don't waste it. So there's those kinds of languages that are coming up. And even if you're from a farming community, it was about the respect, about the effort that had gone into producing that animal. So that's another really interesting point of commonality. And they all thought it was very important that children did know where meat came from. So just to finish up then, what do Australians value in food production? Affordable food. That's definitely one of them. Safe and nutritious food. Locally produced food to support local producers. And humane and respectful animal production. Now, of course, what people think is humane may be very different. There's a question mark there because we're not really sure about the other things yet. And one of the things I'm not really sure about is environmental sustainability. Didn't really come up very much in our stuff at all. And so this is an area I think where we may need to do some specific work. But ideally, I think if we look at this from a perspective of social licence to operate and what are the points of fragility, what are the things that put your social licence at risk, then I think we need to do some further work on how these ideas and attitudes to agriculture become socially and culturally established in Australia. Thank you.